Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the unituk.com, and welcome to this live table talk show, which is being broadcast live from our website. I'm delighted that you could join us today. I'm your host for today's afternoon show. My name is Rick Timmis, and joining me today we have a number of guests. We have Mike Robinson from the ukcolumn.org. Good afternoon, Mike.
Afternoon.
And we have Peter Brown, who is a regular panelist with us. Good afternoon, Peter. How are you again today?
Good afternoon, Rick. I'm fine, thank you. Yeah.
Fantastic. And we have Colin Stewart, who is an independent procurement consultant. Good afternoon, Colin.
Good afternoon.
And, of course, a regular guest to the Table Talk show, we have music producer and political rapper Gadman Dubs. How are you?
Good afternoon, Rick.
And now, for those of you watching as well, we also have our administrator on hand, Sue Deutsch. She will be manning the phones and watching the social media. You can post your comments and questions to our panel of guests by getting in touch with her via the telephone number, which is at the top of the page here. You can call that number or send SMS texts, or if you prefer, you can use Twitter. Just put @the_e_unit in your Twitter line. Or, of course, for those of you watching via YouTube, you can use the Q&A app. Now, joining us today with particular reference to this conversation and the question is our special guest, Rodney Atkinson, who is author of the book Treason at Maastricht, amongst others, and is also, over the last 35 years, has been an advisor to many ministers and members of Parliament. Good afternoon to you, Rodney, and thank you very much for taking the time to join us today.
Good afternoon, you're welcome.
So the question to the panel put forward today is treason. Have the UK politicians committed treason by handing governance across to a foreign power? Now, what I'd like to do first of all is I'm just going to spend a few minutes handing this around to the panel to just get an idea of what we believe treason is. So if I could start with you for a moment, Mike, and just ask you to just see whether you could give us a brief description of what you think, what treason means to you.
Well, treason, as far as I'm concerned, is giving away any sovereignty to a foreign power. But indeed, I probably would expand that slightly in my own mind anyway, to giving away power to, for example, a bank, through the permitting banks to issue money and effectively hold the sovereignty of the country to ransom as a result. But you know, systematically over the last whatever number of decades, we have seen powers and sovereignty handed over to people who are unaccountable and unelected, as far as the UK democracy is concerned, at least, and so that, in my view, has got to be seen as treason. That's it in a nutshell, really, as far as I'm concerned.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mike. Gadman, what's your definition of treason?
Well, obviously it's traitorous and treacherous, and basically it is any transference of power to a foreign nation has to be seen as treason, because it's not in the interest of the people here, and it's basically, if the Queen herself actually is you could be treasonous against the royal family, say, you know, if you conspire against the Queen, that's treason. So there's definitely treason covers a lot of areas, but in the area that's most important to us is that we're losing our sovereignty to a foreign, unelected body, you could say. So I see treason in this day and age. It's the politicians who are giving away power. They're treasonous.
Yeah. So, well, it's rather good because we're already getting messages coming in from the web. So I'll just put one here that's come in from Alan Smith, who has said that the Oxford Dictionary talks about treason, and it says that you'll see it talks about being disloyal or being a traitor to the monarch or to the people. That's the definition of treason. Colin, what are your thoughts? What's your definition of treason?
I think I'll probably go with a more general one for me, which would be dishonesty and disloyalty, lack of loyalty, that results in damage to the interests and structures of the UK and its citizens.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And Peter, what's your take on it? What's your position on what do you think treason is?
I actually can't improve on what Colin just said, to be quite frank.
Okay.
We pretty much covered, I think, the whole gamut.
Yeah, I didn't actually try to link it to the specific topic. I was just talking generally.
Yeah.
I understand, but I mean, treason against the wishes of the people and against the well-being of the people. Anything that does that, to my mind, is treasonous.
Well, of course, in this book that we're going to be talking about today, Treason at Maastricht, we talk about that very subject, and we've all got our idea of what treason is. So I'm going to start by asking Rodney if he could give us a definition of what he feels treason is. Over to you, Rodney.
Well, the point that Norris and I made in 1993, we're coming up to the 21st anniversary of the treason charges laid on the 9th of September that year, is that we didn't need to define treason. The British Constitution defines treason. British law, common law, and statute make quite clear what treason is. All we were doing was pointing out that given that the British Constitution defines treason, what ministers did, in particular the two ministers who signed the Maastricht Treaty, Douglas Hurd and Francis Maude, did, was to break those constitutional statutes and common law and conventions. Of course, it all adds up to a breaking of allegiance in the moral sense. They swore allegiance, as indeed the Queen did in her coronation oath, and the Coronation Oath Act, which put that into law. They swore allegiance, and repeatedly, of course, MPs swear allegiance every time they're elected to Parliament, to the sovereignty of the Queen. That's the titular idea, but far more important in a democracy, the sovereignty of the British people. And that is democratic self-government. So those are the very specific things which constitute treason in our law. So all we said is the British Constitution is crying out, this is treason. Now what these ministers actually did was sign a disgraceful treaty at Maastricht, which completely undermined many statutes of the British Constitution, not least, of course, the idea that instead of governing ourselves, we were governed by a council of ministers where we only had 8% of the votes, or a European Parliament where we only had 15% of the votes. And of course, as anyone with half a brain can see the difference between 8%, 15%, and 100%, 100% being democratic sovereignty. And we did this all in the name of regulation and control of virtually our entire economy, just because we wanted to trade about 8% of our economy with these countries of the European Union. So it made absolutely no sense, either morally, constitutionally, or economically. And that is as true today as it was then. And we presented these charges under a process called misprision. Now, misprision applies to two kinds of criminal offence in this country. And we're talking about criminal offence here. We're not talking about civil offences. And Hurd and Maude, had they been convicted, would have gone to prison for life. They wouldn't have probably been executed because that was high treason. And we didn't accuse them of high treason, we accused them of treason. And misprision says if you're aware of someone committing these crimes, treason is one, the other one is terrorism, and you do not report it, then you are guilty of misprision. And effectively, you can suffer the same consequences as if you had committed the crime itself. So that's what we did in 1993.
So, okay, so this was you and Norris, this is Norris McWhirter from the Guinness Book of Records that we're talking about here.
Yes.
And so you've just given us a précis there of the 9th of September 1993. So this is more than just a book. The book is about actual an actual legal pursuit that you undertook against ministers of the government, Douglas Hurd, as you said.
Yes, indeed. They were the ones who signed this. Interestingly, Francis Maude at the time, I think, was Financial Secretary to the Treasury, and we know Douglas Hurd, of course, was Foreign Secretary. So the Prime Minister of the time, Major, did not go and sign, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, Norman Lamont, did not go to sign. He sent Francis Maude in his place. And I often wonder whether he knew how disgraceful that treaty was.
Of course, the other thing, Rick, is that Jack Straw actually limited the time that someone could be prosecuted for treason down to 3.5 years from the time of actually committing the crime. They thoroughly covered their backsides in that respect.
I don't recall that, I'm afraid.
I'm sorry.
When was that, Peter?
Yeah, Jack Straw in the last government changed the treason laws that the perpetrator could not be prosecuted after 3.5 years from the time of commission. So he covered his backside very well there, and that of other politicians.
Well, I must admit, I'm not aware of that myself. What I am aware of is that I think it's the 1795 Treason Act was actually repealed. Now, no one knows why it was repealed. I think it was because they were trying to get rid of the death penalty. You remember the death penalty was abolished for most things, nearly everything, in 1965. But I think it pertained for high treason. And when they removed it under the last Labour government for high treason, they seem to have got rid of the act itself, not just the penalty, you see what I mean? The Treason Act of 1795. I think, I was talking about this to Lord Tebbit, and Lord Tebbit actually put a question down for the government some years ago, 2-3 years ago. No, it must have been 5 or 6 years ago now, asking why this Treason Act had been repealed. And he got the answer back from the Home Office to say, I'm dreadfully sorry, but there's no one here who remembers now why it was repealed.
Wow.
I mean,
Hey, that's ridiculous. I mean, aren't these things supposed to be written down? Somebody should, so there should be some documentation. You can't just go around changing things and go, well, don't know why we did that.
Well, given the decadence of our political class and the utter collapse of the Home Office, nothing would surprise me. But that is precisely the reply, believe it or not, that Lord Tebbit got as to why the act had been repealed.
The exclusion of high treason.
We get a lot. I mean, I know this conversation of of this idea of treason comes up a lot with the audience and the emails that we get, and I know it's something I follow a bit with the UK column. I mean, with what you're doing down at the UK column there, Mike, are you finding yourself being asked this question a lot by your audience? What activities have you got going on there with regards to this question of treason being committed by politicians?
Well, I mean, this is an issue that we've been talking about since 2008, really, because we helped start the British Constitution Group, really, in an effort to appeal to a reasonably broad proportion of British public, try to get them to understand that we had a constitution and what it stood for, and so we have been pursuing this issue. But of course, just to get back to the repeal of the Treason Act under the Labour government, of course, that in itself, Rodney, would be an act of treason, would it not? Because that's really...
Well, of course, there are other treason acts other than the one they repealed, so they didn't get rid of treason per se. And of course, the principal law under which one of the main laws that we mentioned Magna Carta, Treason Act, Act of Settlement, Coronation Oaths Act, and common law of 1932, and a common law called R versus Thistlewood And R versus Thistlewood was a common law which laid down that undermining the British Constitution is a treasonable act. Now, there's no doubt about it that although in theory our Parliament could at any time retrieve all the powers that we have lost, the fact that we have delegated those powers at all and given away so much for so little, there's no doubt about it that undermined gravely and continues to do the British Constitution, and therefore, according to R versus Thistlewood, that is a treasonable offence. Can I tell you one interesting story about the decadence of our Foreign Office? As of course, Douglas Hurd was one of the signatories to Maastricht, and I remember talking to him at a cocktail party run by the Bow Group back in 1992. This was just before he signed the Maastricht Treaty. And I said to him, Major is going around saying that we're going to emphasize subsidiarity and we're going to get more powers back to the nation states. A bit like Cameron is saying today. And I said to her, do you know damn well, because you must have read the Treaty of Maastricht, that we don't get back one iota of our power? And he paused and he said, yes, that's right.
To follow on from what Rodney said about the exclusion for high treason, that also included mutiny on the high seas and arson on a naval dockyard. But looking at a news report dated the 14th of December 2013 on the subject of high treason, the Lord Chiefs accidentally ditched the Treason Act, which that's the Felony Act, Section 3 of the Felony Act of 1848, which forbade any act that abolished the monarchy, or tried to abolish the monarchy. How very inconvenient.
Yes, indeed. Because, of course, when we were interviewed, Norris and I, outside the Magistrates' Court in 1993, someone from the BBC Today programme asked what we thought the Queen would think of this, and Norris said, well, I'm sure that Mrs. Windsor doesn't know what she is doing. In other words, that what she had done had turned her into what is called a suzerain, that is, someone who is obedient to a real sovereign. In other words, she had sacrificed her sovereignty, and thereby, of course, in a democracy, our sovereignty. But can I just tell you one more slightly sick and amusing story about the Foreign Office that I told Boris Johnson when he was a Telegraph correspondent. He had a column in the Telegraph. It still does, of course, but this was some years ago. And I pointed out that the Maastricht Treaty had allowed anyone in the European Union to come and vote in our general election, to vote for our Westminster Parliament. And I showed him the argument for it. And it's because under Maastricht they say anyone can vote in the municipal elections of any member state. And municipal in international law does not mean local, as we use it. It means national. In other words, we'd given 450 million people the right to vote for our elections at Westminster. So he rang up the Foreign Office and said, this guy Atkinson says, you know, you've given everyone the right to vote in our elections. And this man at the Foreign Office said, oh, rubbish. He said, nonsense. He said, hold on a minute, I'll look it up for you. So he went to get a dictionary, diplomatic dictionary, to look it up. And he said, here you are, municipal law pertaining to the national Oh,
Oh no.
That was the Foreign Office at its prime buffoonish nature. And it shows you the decadence of the political class which has destroyed our constitution and our country.
Of course, the Queen doesn't realise also that if we do go into a federal Europe, she will only be a titular head if she's there at all.
Well, she's already a titular head. She's not even a sovereign anymore, as I say, because the real fact is that we don't govern ourselves, therefore we are not sovereign, therefore she is not the sovereign.
Yeah.
Now this question came up when we did a debate where we were looking at the debates between Nigel Farage and Nick Clegg, and they were talking about these law, you know, the amount of laws that are made in Westminster and the amount of laws that are made in Europe. And of course, I think it was 70% from Nigel Farage. He said 70% from Nigel Farage, and Nick Clegg said 7%. Now, of course, these acts that you're talking about, these transfers of powers, all basically transfer across the right to create these laws. So, you know, so what does this mean for lawmaking in Britain and for the people of Britain who have to abide by these laws?
Yes, well, it means that we no longer have a constitution, we no longer have a parliament, we no longer elect our lawmakers, we can no longer influence the law in this country, and by any definition, that means that, you know, we have destroyed our own democratic constitution. There's no doubt about it. I mean, they can't forever say, oh, well, of course, we could get it back anytime we liked, because that is precisely what our enemies want us to continue to believe up to the final minute when the drawbridge comes down and it's impossible to do anything to retrieve it all.
A prime example of this is the fact that parliaments are getting longer and longer breaks because they don't have enough to do.
Yes, indeed. By the way, one thing on the percentage of national law made by the European Union, the German Parliament actually did set up a commission to find out how many laws were actually made by the Germans and how much by the European Union. And they came to the conclusion that it was about 75% was European Union law and not German. So it shows how much our great internationalist Mr. Clegg knows about Europe.
I understood the Germans to think it was 85%, and it was.
Oh, it could have been 85. Well, it was certainly much higher than Mr.
The
Clegg.
commissioner said it was 75.
It's interesting, though, how the media. It's interesting how the media sort of represents this. One of the things that I've picked up and highlighted a lot, just something simple, was the plain packaging of cigarettes. David Cameron has done an about turn 2 times on plain packaging of cigarettes. First of all, he was not going to do it. Then he was going to wait for an Australian study. Then he was going to do it. Now, when we reported on that, and all that was in the mainstream media, that it presented the proposition that David Cameron and his government were instantiating this policy of their own accord, of their own free will. But in the legislation section of our website, we were tracking all the EU directives as they were being lobbied by Imperial Tobacco and British American Tobacco. The EU was being lobbied to hold back the law and change the law, and the UK's position that David Cameron presenting was following that, absolutely tracking it. So in a nutshell, what I'm saying is we're being lied to. The mainstream media is not telling the truth and saying that these laws are coming from there, and our politicians are trying to create the representation as though it's their idea and their creation, so that they don't exacerbate, and I use that word deliberately, so they don't exacerbate the situation. Now we've got some comments coming in, but I want to get Mike in on this one. Mike.
Well, I was gonna ask for people's views on something, actually, because what I've noticed, and maybe this is too anecdotal and isn't necessarily correct, but it is my perception. I've got a house in France, so maybe it's only France I'm thinking about here, but it is my perception that Britain seems to implement dots the I's and crosses the T's on European directives a lot more than other European countries, and I'm just interested in people's views about why that might be, and why our politicians seem to be so determined to be treasonous.
Could I just say something? there was an interview some years, quite a lot of years ago now, by an American journalist of the European Commission spokesman about Britain in Europe. And the spokesman said to this American journalist, you know, the British are quite extraordinary. They obey the law even when it is not in their interest to do so. Now, you and I would assume that that's what the law is. But that's not the view in Brussels or Berlin, or especially not in Paris. They regard the law as something which you obey when it's convenient and ignore the rest of the time.
What's your take on it, Colin? You're nodding your head there. What's your thoughts on this? Why are we crossing T's and dotting I's? Why are we following all these rules?
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. And what's really interesting about it is my wife's Italian, so I've got Italian family. And I can tell you, you know, through personal experience, the Italians basically pick the laws they want to and adhere to them as they choose, is my view. And if I can give you a very simple, funny example. I went to see my cousin. He invited me to his grotto to taste his grappa. He makes his grappa himself. And as I'm sipping this stuff, which is 60% proof, I said to him, by the way, what did the VAT inspector say about this? He looked at me, laughed, and said, yeah, he comes for a drink as well. And honestly, that pretty well sums it up. And our civil service is just completely naive. And the whole plurality of civil services in France, Italy, the only other place I'd say is like this is probably Germany. I don't know to what extent, but Germany generally, I think, their civil service do have compliance. And the others play the game to our cost. No question about it.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, we've got some comments coming in. Another one from Alan Smith, who's going to post some questions out. But let's just chase this down about that Mike pitched forward about crossing T's and dotted I's. Gadman, what's going on, bruv? Why are we following the rules?
Quite. Maybe it's like Stockholm syndrome or something like that. You know, they're sort of giving up. You know, they're just giving up on the idea of a sovereign. You know, I think. There's a new generation of people that just see themselves as Europeans somehow in their mind or something, and but we are part of Europe, I suppose, but we are actually a sovereign nation, which has its own constitution, it has its own rules, and the rules should be made by us because we know the culture, we live here. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense unless it's corporatism or cronyism, something going on like that, where there's a cabal of maybe bankers, probably, that want to consolidate power, wealth, and political power. It's probably something to do with the bankers somewhere along the line.
Yeah, you're right. It's the European Union was constructed by big business and big banks and big government and big unions as well, don't forget. They were involved at a very early stage, as indeed were a number of churches and royal families. They were involved from the 50s onwards in the European movement, and of course, before we joined the European Union, they set up a European Assembly, which they called it an assembly because they knew damn well it wasn't a parliament. And 90% of the people there, apart from the representatives, were business lobbyists, and that's what they constructed, a borderless commercial venture which was going to greatly enhance their selling power and their profitability. And what they wanted was maximum flexibility of the movement of people to enhance business opportunities. And only much later did some semblance of a parliament emerge. And even today, as we know, it's a bit of a joke. But that is the basis of it. And of course, following the 1960s and 70s in Britain, we became less and less capitalist and more corporatist. And corporatism is very much the first stage to a fascist state. And that is what the European Union is really all about. and that's what my other two books, well, three books on this subject, really cover. Europe's Full Circle, which I wrote in 1997, and Fascist Europe Rising in 2001, where this process of the destruction of communities and voters and democracy and real capitalism, where people are responsible as producers to the consumers through competition, all that went out. The state got more powerful. Big business got laws passed in its own image. And, of course, it was then a natural step to embrace the corporatist European Union, which is what we have done.
Now we've got some comments coming in, but just that's really kind of highlighted something for me that I reported on, or we reported on here at the unit earlier this week. The narrative had been coming out about obviously this the assault on cigarettes and tobacco industry, with various new regulations taking place and these EU directives being implemented. But what's not being connected or reported in that narrative, it's almost being pushed away, is that of course there is a move taking place at the moment, a health sort of a health incentive, if you could call it that. This move towards e-cigarettes, which are a replacement for traditional cigarettes. They give you basically a small amount of nicotine without all of the other substances. Now, whilst the regulations are coming down hand over fist to put plain packets on tobacco and so on and so forth, it's the tobacco industry that is working with the European Commission and Council of Ministers to write up that policy. And it's switching backwards and forwards was causing Cameron over the last years to go and say, we're putting them in plain packets, we're not, and so on and so forth. But what's not being said is that the e-cigarette movement, which is a free market at the moment, is about to be regulated. It's going to be regulated, and all e-cigarettes are going to become medical devices. And the manufacture and supply of those medical devices is going to be handed over to the tobacco industry. They're going to take responsibility for it, and distribution of them is going to be handed over to pharmaceutical chains. So when you connect that, it's clear to see what's happening here. These laws are not being created or manipulated in the interests of the constituents or the ministers or the people that represent us, you and me on the ground. It's being done for the benefit of capitalist shareholders and corporate businesses, big global corporate businesses, and that's just one example.
Yeah. And I think the other thing we've got to remember is that we also paved the way for this corporatist, anti-democratic European Union, and indeed in our own country as well, by making politicians professional politicians and not democrats. The more the state pays the representatives of the people, in other words, the more they are professional politicians, the less power the people have. It's obvious when you come to think of it. But that has also greatly aided the power of big business to manipulate MPs.
Yeah, because they can sit on the board of directors, can't they, of companies that lobby them, and I mean, it reeks of corruption. It's all corrupt.
And the fact that you start by paying them straight away, as soon as they get to power, the state pays them. Now, who is more important to them, the state that pays them, or the voters who elect them to represent us against the state? It's obvious who's more important to them.
Well, if Cameron takes away
to make money, then big business knows that money is important to them, and therefore they can buy patronage and buy legislation.
So now we're getting some other comments here coming through, and I do want to make sure that the audience that's out there can get these across to us. You can text us, or you can call on the telephone number above, or you can use our social media channel. Just put @TheEUnit in there. Alan Smith has said, he makes a point, he said that there are over 30,000 rules and regulations made, and so even if it is 7 or 8%, that is a massive number of regulations. And that also we need to remember that on the 1st of November this year comes into effect, the EU will take over completely. He says, it's not true that our governments haven't cared a hoot about this country. They have all persistently given our rights away, from Alan Smith. And Les Webster says, in answer to the question, he says, yes, our politicians have committed treason, but Magna Carta forbade the monarch allowing laws to be introduced here by a foreign power, not Parliament. We need a democratic revolution to get rid of our MPs and the establishment. Wow. What do you make of that one, people?
Well, of course, next year is the anniversary of Magna Carta, so we have an opportunity to organise people's views on this, and you know, getting back to the idea of representation. Of course, MPs and politicians are not representing their constituents anymore. They're representing the preconceived policies to the constituents, and that's the reversal of democracy, as far as I can see. But you know, we have an opportunity with the anniversary of Magna Carta next year to remind everybody of of the British Constitution, what it represents, and perhaps you know, we also have a general election at the same time, so there is an opportunity to do something there, I think.
Oh, absolutely. I think there is. I think I'd very much like to discuss that with you as a separate conversation, Mike.
Rodney, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
The timing of Cameron's promise for a referendum is late 2017. Now, one thing that greatly concerns me is that even with a vote to come out, the timing of the notification of cessation could easily run into 2018, namely after May 18. That would then leave us with a situation of 2 years of negotiation that will run into another government. Now,
no, isn't it May 1919 that the next one is due?
I thought it's 2015. 2020. 5 years. It's 2015, then 2020 with the Parliament Act.
Yeah.
Article 50 actually lays down the rules for the negotiation, but also goes on to say that it can be extended past the 2 year period. Now, if Cameron's government was allowed to delay the ending of the 2 year period, it would take us into another Parliament, which constitutionally is not bound by the decision of the previous government. Do you not find that a bit worrying?
Yeah, well, I reject totally this idea of Article 50. I do not see ourselves as being part of their constitution. If we assert our constitution, which we have every right to do, then it is our constitution which shall govern our negotiations and our decision to leave or not to leave.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Article 50 is a trap, and a very convoluted and threatening trap as well.
Yeah, I mean, to my mind, we should immediately repeal the 1972 Act, which would give us immediate sovereignty back.
Well, perhaps I can tell you a little bit now about the British Declaration of Independence, which was launched in 1999. The idea of it is it sets out on one piece of paper the opposite of everything that's happened. You know, that we have a parliament, that we govern ourselves, that we have habeas corpus, etc., etc., and that we should put down, and the people who sign it commit to putting down a bill in Parliament to that effect. And as soon as that bill is passed, then all contradictory acts which have preceded it would be repealed, including, of course, Section 2 of the 1972 Act.
Yeah,
so
also, Article 50 states that if we do start negotiation for trade, that the Council of Ministers will exclude us from all dealings.
Exactly, it's a trap. The whole thing is a scandalous trap, and I'm surprised that Christopher Booker is promoting it. I mean, you know, we make our own laws in our own country. I mean, even the Euro-federalists say we have the right at any time to pass a law and come out. So that's indeed what we should do. But the referendum is not just a typical Cameron manipulation that you'd expect from him, but the whole idea of a referendum is a nonsense. because it doesn't solve anything. You can be defeated and you're there, whether you like it or not, or you could actually win the referendum and it doesn't make a jot of difference, because you still need a majority in Parliament to pass the sovereignty bill. So a referendum is a trap, just the same as Article 50 is a trap.
What's the British Constitution Group's point of view on this, Mike? I mean, we're talking here about about this. What's that with their view?
Just pretty much as Rodney says, we need to reassert the constitution that we have, and of course, part of that, is how to put this. Right, we've got to reassert the constitution that we have. We've got all the principles by which we should be governed, the right to govern ourselves, in writing in various constitutional documents. It's true, it's not in a simple one-page format, but it's there to be understood, and we've got to reverse this constitutional reform agenda that the last two governments have been pushing through, and of course leaving Europe is part and parcel of that. But as I say, we have the word reassert is, I think, is the right word, because everything's there already.
Now, in the Lisbon Treaty, the Lisbon Treaty has this Article 50, which is what we're talking about at the moment, and Rodney says that that's a trap. Peter thinks that that's a problem for us. Do you guys have a position on how Britain ought to extricate itself from the EU? Should the people of Britain decide they want to do that? What's your view, Mike?
How we extricate ourselves is an issue for people that have more understanding of that than I do, to be honest. But at the end of the day, before we can even have that discussion, we've got to get people in the mindset of understanding what it is that they're likely to lose, or what it is they have already lost, and what they're going to lose in the not too distant future if they don't appreciate the position that we're in at the moment, and really make their voices heard about what they where they think we should be going in the future. The right to self-determination is a fundamental right, and the imposition, the overlaying of European-style law on top of our own is a major loss of the rights that we have in this country, and we're starting to see even attacks on the whole jury system in this country, or the whole basis of our legal system and our law. So we've got to first appreciate what it is that we have, and what we are in the process of losing, and as I say, better people than I can discuss how we actually extricate ourselves from this situation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I just say there's no need to fall into the trap of even some Eurosceptics, and certainly the Euro-federalists, who say, oh, it's all too complicated now, we can't renegotiate all these thousands of deals and agreements and regulations. Utter rubbish. You don't need to renegotiate, you just decide whether you want them or not, as we used to before we were taken over by a foreign power. Your parliament decides. You can let everything stay there, and then you look at it case by case, and you repeal it or not case by case. You don't have to have a great big complicated renegotiation. And certainly if you are going to negotiate, then you should never renegotiate with your jailer while you're sitting in jail. You come out of the jail and you say, right, now then, we're on equal footing. You want to sell to us, we want to sell to you. See what agreements we can come to. Exactly the same as we do to the 160 other countries in the world, in other words.
Mm-hmm. But you know what? It's a simple solution, to this pulling out. If you used to stay in there and negotiate with them, you're giving legitimacy to the whole scam. The fact is, it's totally illegal, and it is treasonous. So even if we have a referendum, that's asking the people to commit treason. So you're saying, do you want to give away power to a foreign nation? So you can't. to be honest, we could just totally ignore everything that was ever, any legislation that ever came from overseas. We could totally ignore that and just stick with what we've got in the UK. It's simple as that. We don't have to negotiate with them. We just say to them, all your statutes, all your laws, they're irrelevant. You know, if you want to trade with us, fair enough. If you want to exchange security information for the police forces and things like that, that's fair enough. But everything else they're irrelevant to us. There's nothing to do. I mean, the EU is like its own country. It's got a flag, it's got a national anthem, it's got a bank, it's got getting a standing army. Basically, it's like a mini country. Like, you know, you've got the Vatican City. It is a country, and it's trying to take over our country.
Now that highlights a problem. I read this in Rodney's book, so this is from you. But what it said was that right now we're struggling with a problem, and that is that there are only a few of us that seem to be awake to what's taking place. But the problem we face is that whilst treason, it seems, is being committed against the UK, we're very rapidly closing a point whereby so much law and so much power will have been transferred that to speak out or to act against the EU as a country with its flag and constitution would be treason against the EU. What happens if we reach that point?
It already is.
Well,
that would be hell on earth. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this was all the problem, wasn't it? You see, if you let things go long enough, you end up as with a different sovereignty in a different state, and then if you try and get out, then they call you treasonous. Of course, they wouldn't never admit that they committed treason in the first place. Therefore, you know, this is extremely dangerous territory. We all know that. And one of the most evil things is not just the constitutional destruction, but the popular construction of the destruction of our people by mass immigration. Now, the purpose, the British political class and British business thought they were signing an agreement with other countries in the European Economic Community to trade freely and fairly. It was never about that. They were told it was never about that. But they are so greedy and naive and ignorant, they assumed it was. Now, of course, they're realizing a bit late that it wasn't that way. And this is another conversation I had with Hurd at the same time, when I said, Mr. Hurd, the Anglo-Saxon view of trade is quite simple. Free trade means the movement of capital, goods, and services, so that mass movements of people are not necessary. And he said, oh, I'd never thought of it like that. And I said, well, yes, well, you should have done, because the European Union is about the exact opposite. It doesn't want free trade in order to force people to move. And that is what is happening, of course, as we know. Masses of people are moving across borders per force because of mass unemployment and destitution in places like Greece and Spain and Italy and Ireland. And that was a deliberate policy, in my view, to destroy the nation states and their peoples.
There's a worrying development that occurred last week. Back in 2009, when the Lisbon Treaty was signed, it was agreed that the wording of Article 222 would be postponed. That was actually completed on the 26th of last month. Basically, it's an extension of the agreement of mutual support across the EU. But this Article 222 goes much further. Basically, it's given the right for the EU to send in supernatural national police and armed forces and to quell, they say terrorist act, but the wording is so obscure that the EU will have no trouble at all to include insurrection in that.
Yeah, protesters, it says, doesn't it?
Yeah. And the thing is, they'll be sending foreign troops in that will have no sympathy with us. All it requires is that the government at the time asks for the help as a last resort. Now, if there's major insurrection in this country, as there may well be if the politicians force us into an EU that we don't want, it's quite likely there's going to be insurrection, and they will then use foreign troops to quell that. They've already given themselves the right to use lethal force in Article 2 of the Declaration of Human Rights. Not the right word, it's the fundamental rights. But
well, let's just take a straw poll a moment, and for people watching watching this right now, if you want to get in touch with us and let us know what your view is, let's go back to the original question and say, have UK politicians committed treason by handing over power to the foreign land? Let's start with you, Gadman. What's your view? Have they or have they not? Guilty, not guilty?
Guilty as charged, most definitely. I believe they should forfeit their occupation and let the real politicians, the real people, take their place that actually care about the British people and its culture and its prosperity and its welfare. You know, these people really aren't politicians anymore. They're just corporate entities guising themselves as politicians. So
okay.
Yeah, they are guilty.
Colin, what's your take? What's your view?
Well, unfortunately, as I'm listening to this, it poses more questions for me than answers. I would say you're right, they're treasonous, but I'm not exactly sure that they're criminals in the sense that there may be many of them who had the right intention. I mean, if you were to line up all the Westminster establishment on this discussion, there would be arguments vehemently against what you're saying, and there would be lots of arguments that were saying it's in the interests of the British people to continue. Now, you know, I respect these people in the sense that they're not idiots. You know, many of them are probably much more intelligent than me, and I keep coming back to the same point here, and this is maybe the end of the conversation, which is, so what? Even if they did even if there was treason, in terms of now and the interests of the British people and my children, if you like, what do I do about it? What do we do? That's what is the pregnant question for me. And it's all right talking about whether it was or it wasn't treason. The issue is, so what? What are we going to do about it? And unfortunately, despite incredible amounts of efforts by everybody here, and I'm sympathetic like you are, we just don't seem to be cutting the mustard. We're just not carrying the public. They're either asleep or just don't see what we're saying. If I can give you an example, I was talking about this to a very senior guy in UKIP. I would say who it was. And I was talking about this, and I was basically saying to him, sovereignty is one of the biggest issues coming up, and UKIP hasn't touched it really. It's been on other technical matters like the economy, immigration, etc., etc. They're not just technical, they're crucial. But sovereignty for me is the essence and the core of the argument. Yeah. And he looked at me and he was clearly dubious, and he basically said, it's too subtle for the British electorate. And I was gobsmacked by him saying that. Absolutely gobsmacked.
Was that after his meeting with Murdoch?
Sorry?
Was that after his meeting with Murdoch?
No, it wasn't. It was him. No, it was a guy very close to him, I will say, from the north. And I was absolutely gobsmacked. In fact, what he said to me is, he said, the typical Liverpudlian wouldn't understand what you're talking about. That's what he said.
That's pretty scary, though, don't you think?
It is, actually, because I'm supposed to be a parliamentary candidate, and I'm supposed to be able to send and transmit these messages effectively. And I want to persuade people because I feel passionately about it. But either everybody's asleep or we just aren't hitting the hot buttons. And my final point would be Maggie Thatcher. Maggie Thatcher, during her time, had a running fight with the Foreign Office. And the kernel of what her argument was is that the Foreign Office did not believe in the UK. It was planning for the UK to be a second-string nation, and she just wouldn't have that. I think that's still around. I think that mentality is still around, and I don't believe that. I think we're a very, very important nation and very, very capable. And I'm sure you're the same as me, to gain our self-respect back.
Yeah. Can I come in next, please, Rick?
Yes, Peter. What do you think? Guilty, not guilty, and comments?
Very definitely guilty. But follow on from what Colin was saying, I know the guy that he's talking about. But also, I've been talking to someone almost, actually much more senior than him, who tells me that the emphasis for UKIP this year is discussion on QMV and the JHA. They're done deals. What the hell are they going to talk about those for?
What's What's the JHA and what's QMV?
Justice and Home Affairs legislation. And the
by majority voting is the other one.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Are you saying that UKIP's been compromised in some way? That sort of like, in some way, they're sort of diluting their stance on getting out.
I believe they're not doing what they could do, Chris, and that is to actually inform the people what is going to happen if we end up in a federal Europe.
So let's ask that question. Yes, well, I'm going to pose a question for now, which is that it seems to me the consensus seems to be that there is a case to be answered here. Now, I know from your book, I'm going to throw this to you. Obviously, 9th of September or whenever it was, you went to the courts. The book is about going to the courts. What happened when the cases got presented before the juries? What was the jury's point of view, Rodney? What did they think?
They were presented under so-called informations at the magistrates' court, and they were forced to take them in. They passed them on to the Crown Prosecution Service because, as I said, although this was a constitutional matter, because it was treason, it was a criminal offence. And then month after month went by and nothing happened. Lord Stoddart in the Lords stood up and asked the government what had happened to the treason charges. And eventually the Solicitor General ruled that they should not proceed. Of course he did, but he was a judge in his own cause, obviously. And this is the political class, defends itself. And in this case, of course, it was a constitutional matter, not a political matter. But the people who make the decisions are effectively politicians. And so, but don't forget, our purpose was not to put Maud and Hurd in prison, however much I thought it would have been a salutary lesson to them. Nevertheless, the main purpose was to put down in writing specifically all the destructions that had taken place.
Have you had any dealings with mandamus at all, Rodney?
No.
Mandamus?
No.
Because it seems to me that a High Court can force Cameron to do his duty under the Constitution.
Yes, but you know what the High Courts are like. The courts say, listen, this is political, it's constitutional, it's a matter for Parliament. Parliament is sovereign. It's an irony that they would say Parliament is sovereign. Just like it would be ironic next year when all these fatuous politicians stand up to celebrate Magna Carta when they themselves have destroyed much of Magna Carta on the altar of the European Union. But let me go back to UKIP, because I came within a few votes of becoming leader of UKIP in 2000. But I and hundreds of others resigned because of sundry corruptions in that vote. So, in other words, if people complain today about the Nigel Farage does a very good job and all the rest of it, but there isn't exactly a sophisticated leading team there, is there? And I think this is a great disadvantage as regards explaining to the people exactly how dangerous the position is. And I'm afraid the British people always leave it till the last moment before they react, and maybe it's the case here as well. But it's not just us. We do have a big movement now in this country. There's massive movements in all the other European countries as well, even in Germany, which has made billions out of this catastrophe. I started the Free Nations website in 1994, and we have people clocking on there from over 100 countries. Now, in other words, there's a worldwide desire for nationhood and sovereignty and democracy, and against these supranational corporate powers. So there is hope for the future.
But not too late, though.
Wow. You're kind of breaking my heart there, though, Rodney, now. Broken my heart, because now I'm thinking, where is the escape now then? Because if UKIP are really sort of almost bit wavy, you know, they're not on solid ground really. They're just sort of saying it, but they're not. How are we going to actually get out of this, you know, dictatorship in Europe? Because all the other parties are sort of pro-Europe.
Well, no, I think within each of those parties, the number of sovereignty activists is growing all the time, and the threat from UKIP is forcing more and more of them to own up to what they've done and are prepared to reverse it. So, but the point is, we've got to make sure before people are elected to Parliament that they actually are prepared to sign up to our democratic sovereignty. And that is what the British Declaration of Independence does. We haven't got time to talk about it today, but perhaps some other time, if it is indeed launched again for the next election. Because the last time it was launched, the first time in 1999, all the three major parties were absolutely trembling at the prospect of the British Declaration of Independence, because all their candidates thought, this looks very reasonable. It says we have a parliament, a democracy, we make our own laws, that must be perfectly all right. I'll find out whether I can sign it. They went to their party leaderships, and the party leadership said, you can't sign this.
Wow.
Ooh, what a good tool.
Therefore, it was an educational process for the people who wanted to sign it, the MPs, and told they can't sign up for democracy and their country and their parliament, and for the ministers who had to admit for the first time that we didn't have a country, a parliament, a democracy, and the last thing they would allow their MPs to do was to sign up to it.
Wow, that's terrible.
Of course, the European Parliament has no legislative powers anyway.
Exactly.
It's only the Politburo, the Commission, that can actually put forward any legislation at all, and all the Parliament does is agree. Nothing more.
Well,
the Council of Ministers.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. We're now we're basically more or less at the end of our show now, the live show on here. Obviously, the debate goes on. I find it fascinating that the case has never been answered. You know that the Crown Prosecution Service has not followed this through. I would very much like.
Can I just say, if there was a conclusion of the British establishment and the Crown Prosecution Service, it was this: that if treason had been committed, then the 1993 Act, which ratified Maastricht, made that treason legal. Right? That was their conclusion.
In their eyes, in their opinion, but that's what it really is. Their statutes and acts are just opinions. They're not actually law or lawful.
Well, that's what we've come to. So evil has our Parliament become that we can no longer call what they pass as laws legal laws. But you know, that's a tragedy.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, what we've found here, and I know Mike will probably say something similar to this as well, but what we've found here at the unit is, particularly when we go out and do our public speaking presentations, it's the truth that's really important. When you get down to the facts and the truth, and you present that before people, a little bit, and you know, I'm very motivated by what you said there about this declaration, the British Declaration of Independence. I think that's a tremendous tool, Rodney, and I would be delighted if we could perhaps do a show to cover that in more depth and look at that with you again. That would be wonderful. The key is to get out there to the truth with and put it in front of people in a way that they can kind of take it on board. People, you can't wake people up by running them over with a juggernaut. You've got to wake them up slowly by feeding them the information and keeping the facts and keeping the information going out there. That's what we do here at the UK. The Unit UK is we focus specifically on what the European Union is doing geopolitically all around the globe, and also on what its legislature is doing, and that's what this site is dedicated to. The ukcolumn.org, for example, gives you daily interpretations of what's happening back here in the UK, and I'll hand that to Mike to tell us a little bit about what you guys are doing at the UK column, Mike, to uncover the truth and deliver that to people.
Look, I would agree with that. I just wanted to, before I do that, I'd just like to say a couple of things about what Colin said earlier, because he asked, are people asleep? I think in our experience, we're seeing that more and more people are engaging on they recognize that there are issues, they're engaging on those issues, and they're asking questions, and I think that's the point at which people are ripe for the information, because it's not being shoved down their throats at that point. They're starting to ask the questions. But I think it's not a case that people are generally asleep. It's a case that people are finding life more and more difficult, requiring 2 salaries in the home and this kind of thing. So people are on a treadmill, and they can't keep up with what's going on. But people are starting to ask the questions now, and I think that's a good thing. And I just wanted to say something else about what Colin said, because Colin mentioned that he thought that MPs had acted with the right intention. Now, of course, that doesn't really matter, because ignorance of the law is no excuse, and the constitutional law says that giving away sovereignty is unlawful and is an act of treason. And I think that people still have to be held to account for that. So right intention or not, I think it's they still have to stand up and be counted and be accountable for what they've done. But in terms of what we're doing, really we're just telling it as it is. We've got a daily news program, as you know, and we've got a team of researchers that are pulling out as much information as possible, not only European legislation and European policy that's coming in, but also policy that's being pushed through from various from the third sector and from the United Nations as well. So it's not just Europe that policy is originating in. And so that's what we're aiming to do, but we are getting a much better response now than we were even 12 months ago.
Well, I mean, I want to really close this down now, and it just remains really for me to thank all of our guests that have joined us today. It feels to me so much like this conversation has only just got going. We clearly have only scratched the surface. What I would say is that in the show notes there are going to be links to the UK column. I would encourage our viewers and visitors to the Unit UK to go and take a look at the UK column and do a live stream news show that you can find out. So keep in touch there. That'll keep it real for you. For what's going on in Europe and what they're doing, then obviously you've got this channel here. There's going to be links in the notes to this program to Rodney's book, Treason at Maastricht. And I actively encourage you, if you've watched this show, to get a copy of that book. If you get it on Kindle, for example, the cost is really quite low, and read it. It is your jaw will hit the floor. It is absolutely astonishing. Needless to say, just a big thank you once again to our regular panelists, Gadman Dubs and Peter Brown, and of course Sue Deutsch for putting all the questions forwards. One comment coming here from Ken Lagarde, who called to say that they are most definitely guilty as charged, and we should be recalling our MPs and getting them to answer. Thank you very much for taking your time to join us today here on this live webcast at theunituk.com. It just remains for me to say that I'm Rick Timmis, and I'll see you soon.